All right. Good evening. I hope everybody is adjusting well to e-learning and online learning. Um, Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everybody knows I'm going to try and make this e-learning experience as normal as possible. I know that you thought that maybe you would be getting a break from notes, but it looks like that's not going to be happening. So today, what we're going to be talking about is the rise of dictators in Europe. If you don't mind, go ahead and get your notes out and try and follow along. Remember, normally these lectures would take the full 52 minutes, but you guys with the pause function, if I happen to be going too fast, feel free to hit the pause button, catch up, and we'll try and get these done a little bit quicker. So, dictators are on the rise in Europe. Much of that has to do with uh, the uh, the fact that Europe is economically vulnerable. Remember, as bad as the Great Depression was for the United States, it is definitely worse in Europe. And so, as you know, normally reasonable people become desperate to feed their families, they start to turn to dictators that promise things that democracy can't really promise. In a democracy, you always have an opposition party. You've got, a parliament or a Congress that you have to deal with. And, that sometimes can be slow. With these dictators, they don't have to deal with an opposition party because they've probably killed them. They don't have to deal with any real legislative body like Congress or Parliament, although they might still have those institutions. They're mostly just symbolic. So what we'll see is, several dictators will pop up all across Europe. So in the Soviet Union, you have Joseph Stalin, who is here in the right here, the bottom left. You're going to see in Italy, Benito Mussolini right here. And then next on the bottom, closer to the right here, we have Francisco Franco. And then in Japan, we'll see the rise of Emperor Hirohito, who's really being manipulated by his top military commander, Tojo. So, first of all, to understand these dictators and the kind of political authority that they have within their own countries, you have to understand totalitarianism and what exactly totalitarianism is. Um, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The idea is, the root word there is total. Totalitarianism is total control over not just the government, but over the individual citizens' lives. You can see here it's the political authority exercises absolute and centralized control over all aspects of life. This doesn't just mean that the government and the dictator determines what your tax rate is. It actually, in fact, means complete and total control over every part of life. These dictators will be able to tell you what job you can have. They will determine which books get published. As a matter of fact, in Hitler's Germany, if your book didn't uh, you know, praise Hitler, it probably wouldn't get published. If you wanted to play what we call soccer, what Europe calls football, it was Hitler Youth Football. And part of the coach's job was not just to teach you how to play soccer, but was also to praise Hitler and to, teach and indoctrinate young people into the Nazi Party. The government exercised complete control over the type of music that was being produced. And so, in either, Italy or the Soviet Union, the all music would essentially be praising the government, just to make sure that their population is being completely indoctrinated. The individual is subordinate to the state. In America, we always kind of feel like the government is here to serve our needs, that they work for us. But these totalitarian dictatorships flip that on its head, and it's the individual who needs to serve the state. Right. And so, in these totalitarian dictatorships, you start to see, these choreographed rallies that I think Hitler probably does the best, even though Benito Mussolini was first to have these gigantic rallies. What you're looking at here is a picture of the Nuremberg rallies. The Nuremberg rallies were choreographed to, make the Nazi Party and Hitler in particular look all powerful. They are these terrible events, and so the Nuremberg rallies, the first anti-Jewish laws in Germany, will come out of some of these rallies. But they are nevertheless very impressive with how well they're organized. And again, it's designed to make the government look powerful and to make the individual look small and insignificant. Right. And so, what always corresponds with the rise in totalitarianism is also a rise in militarism. The thing that makes you obey the government is always, a man with a gun. And, even in a democracy, a lot of times, we have laws, and if you break them, a man with a gun shows up and takes you away. Well, in democracies, there's checks and balances to make sure that those laws are as just as possible. Uh, but in a totalitarian dictatorship, that's not going to happen. The laws are just the whim of the dictator. And so to be able to, have laws that can be, arbitrary and unfair and, brutally repressive, uh, you have to also see a rise in militarism, and you'll see that in these countries uh, as the government gets more powerful to be able to enforce its will. The militaries are going to, play a large part in that. Right. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time specifically talking about the fascist dictators. The fascist dictators are Franco in Spain, Benito Mussolini in Italy, and most famously Adolf Hitler in Germany. And, Joseph Stalin is not a fascist. We had talked about him earlier. He is a communist. And, we've spent some time defining communism in this class. Now, Joseph Stalin's communist government is, in fact, a totalitarian government. It has complete control, it owns all the property, it determines what books get written, what plays are get produced, what's playing on the radio. It determines that it is totalitarian. Fascism is going to be another system of government that's actually very similar to communism. It is totalitarian. And so you'll see the definition here looks very similar to the definition of totalitarianism, a system of government marked by the centralization of authority under a dictator. And some of these fascist governments will be more totalitarian than others. Hitler's government in Germany is very totalitarian and very similar in most ways to the totalitarian dictatorship in the Soviet Union. But then you'll also see fascist dictators like Francisco Franco, who don't have as much control as what Adolf Hitler will have. These fascist governments, the fascists will like to tell you, and what we know is that the fascists will make an effort to distance themselves from the communists. When in absolutely most ways, the fascist governments are incredibly similar to the Soviet governments, but the fascists try to differentiate themselves, and that's primarily going to be based on two concepts. One is going to be nationalism. The fascists are going to be very nationalistic, and so they're going to believe that their country is best and that their people are best, and it will take on racial overtones. The Germans will be overtly racial, and Hitler is emphatic about the racial superiority of the Aryans over, every other race, essentially, primarily the Jews. And it's going to be this that really makes the biggest distinction between communism and fascism. Hitler, to make that distinction with his propaganda secretary, Joseph Goebbels, is really going to start a campaign to associate fascism as a right wing ideology. That's interesting because the actual name of the Nazi party is the NSDAP, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Um, and, the similarities between fascism and communism are too many to go over here. But what we see is Hitler hated the communists, and so he spins fascism as a right wing ideology because he wants to distance himself from the communists because he believes that their philosophy for why they're totalitarian is wrong. The communists believe that totalitarian dictatorships are necessary so the poor can overtake the rich. Hitler believes that these totalitarian dictatorships are necessary for racial reasons, so that the Aryans can get what is rightfully theirs, that has been taken from them by these other races. And so what you see is Hitler is, going to use fear of communism to get people to join the NSDAP. Um, and so he doesn't want to play up the similarities between fascism and communism. He wants people to think that they're actually the opposite, which in reality that they're just not. Um, right now, just like in a communist totalitarian dictatorship, they're only able to maintain their power through suppression of any opposition through terror and censorship. What you see is, and Hitler figures this out very early, and so does Joseph Stalin and the communist Soviet Union, is that if you really want to get people to behave in the way that you want them to behave, you don't just threaten them. Hitler will fill prisons with, primarily young males very quickly when he comes to power, because everybody knows young men are very dangerous, and so he'll arrest them. But he quickly realizes there's not enough prison space, and so he's got to get these young men who can serve in his army, and these young men that can be better used at work, making ammunition or tanks or whatever he needs. He needs them out in the real world. And so what he figures out is, you don't threat to get people to behave. You don't just threaten um, that person's liberty or life. If you really want to get them to behave, you threaten the people they love. And so, what the Nazis will do, just like the communists in the Soviet Union, is if there's any misbehavior or even a belief that there might be some sort of anti government behavior, Hitler will arrest your family, kill your wife or children. They call that black bagging, when the government shows up and all of a sudden your family disappears. It's one thing to risk your own life and liberty for, your beliefs, if they happen to be anti-government. It's an entirely different thing to risk the lives of the people that you love. And so what we see is that Hitler doesn't just threaten he threatens your family. One of the other things he does is, because it's a totalitarian dictatorship, and the schools, it's a complete and total control. So the school textbooks are all Nazi propaganda, or in the Soviet Union, Soviet propaganda. But we're going to focus mostly on Hitler here. Um, those textbooks are indoctrinating the kids. The teachers, to have those jobs, must tout the Nazi party line. And so kids from the very youngest age are told that their entire lives should be lived to glorify Adolf Hitler. And so these kids believe that the indoctrination works, and it creates a really scary home environment for parents, because these parents have been around a while. They know that there's something amiss by the time they get into the 1940s, and they know that the government is doing things that they shouldn't do. But even if you speak about those things at your own kitchen table, your children are likely to turn you in. And so, the teachers in the schools are constantly asking the kids about, what did your parents say last night at dinner? Like, are they glorifying Hitler? Are they glorifying the Nazi party? And if the answer to that is no, you might end up, black bagged, and, your family might disappear. And kids are rewarded for turning in their parents. So this suppression uh, through terror and censorship reaches all the way into the home. You're not even safe in your own home. All right, so now we're going to start to talk about a few of these dictators and kind of how they rise to power. We're going to start off with Benito Mussolini. Excuse me a second while I have a sip of my how do we say this, LaCroix. That was a product placement, and I'm being paid for that advertisement. No, I'm not. My jokes are even bad at home. I don't know what I was thinking. All right, so back at it. Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini is actually going to be Europe's first, or the world's first, fascist dictator. He was a former kindergarten teacher. I've always kind of mistrusted kindergarten teachers, and I think Benito Mussolini is, uh, you know, uh, a good example of why. I don't understand why anybody would want to spend that much time with kids that young. It just makes no sense to me. And so Benito Mussolini moves on and becomes the first fascist dictator in Europe. As a matter of fact, he's going to set an example that Hitler is going to try to follow later. Hitler will actually fail in his attempts to be like Benito Mussolini, to rise to power like Benito Mussolini, but he will definitely be trying to follow in Benito Mussolini's footsteps. So Italy's got a lot of the same problems that the rest of Europe has. There's high unemployment. There's inflation that is causing the Italian money to be worth less and less. And because of that, we start to see a real fear in Italy about the rise of communism. And so, as more and more people are becoming poor and losing their jobs and out of work, those poor people are looking at the middle class and the rich, and they're starting to say, I want what you have. And communism promises them that, right? That the communists will take over. And when they take over, they will redistribute the wealth from the rich and the middle class. Well, Benito Mussolini is going to play on those fears, and is really going to go to the middle class, and he's going to say, you worked hard for the things that you have. And the communists will come and just take that from you. And so if you join my political party and you help put me in power, then I will protect all those things that you worked so hard to get. And what you start to see is people start flocking to Benito Mussolini. The other thing that he does really well is unemployed men. He's going to start to actually employ them and use those men. He essentially says, "Hey, look, if you're looking for something to do, come join me, and I will celebrate you." As a young man, and I will, allow you to do all the things that young men want to do. Like, let's go beat up some communists and work our aggression out on them. And he will do that. That group of young men will be known as his black shirts. The black shirts are just a paramilitary organization. So paramilitary means like pseudo military. It means it's modeled after the military. The Boy Scouts of America are a good example of a paramilitary group. But that's a rather benign paramilitary group. The black shirts are older and are organized to be violent. And so what Benito Mussolini does is he gathers all of his supporters and his black shirts, and he marches on Rome, the capital of Italy. And as he marches on Rome, his followers, and this march is miles and miles and miles and miles, his followers start to grow. There's a real tension in Italy. People don't like the king anymore. And, as his black shirts, as Mussolini and his black shirts are marching on Rome, the crowds start to just get larger and larger and larger. Sorry. And the king kind of sees the writing on the wall. Eventually, Mussolini will show up and demand power, and the king will just hand it over. It's a relatively bloodless coup d'état. What you know, when the king just says, "Fine, you can have power," Mussolini says, "All right, thanks." And now the fascists are in control without really having to, have this some bloody violent coup. It helps that his message has been a message that the military has been very receptive to. And so, because of that, the king's not exactly sure whether or not his military will back him, the king, or Mussolini. And so the king essentially is going to abdicate. It's at this point Benito Mussolini takes the nickname El Duce, which has got to be one of the best nicknames ever, which just means the leader. And then he starts to eliminate all signs of democracy. He says essentially, and this is the same message that lots of dictators around Europe are going to say. They're just going to say, look, we tried democracy. Democracy is a relatively new idea, been around, in its modern form for just a, few hundred years at this point. And he said, democracy is not equipped to deal with crisis. And it's failed in Italy. It's failing, he says, all over Europe. And so it's time to dismantle it and go back to, these strong leaders, that are now taking the shape of dictators instead of, kings. And so he immediately starts to take apart democracy in Italy. Um, his catchphrase becomes "Believe, obey, work." Again, another sign of this totalitarianism that says that the individual is subject to the will of the state. Believe in your government, believe in Mussolini, obey your government, obey Mussolini, and I will get you back to work. And he does. There's no doubt about it. The first few years of Mussolini's rule are going to be very productive, just like the same thing that happens in the communist Soviet Union, and just like when Hitler takes over as well, these guys, at least initially, are going to see some pretty decent economic success. The problem with these kind of dictatorships, though, is generally speaking, and history has proven this over and over and over again, is that although you can, with a strong hand, in the short term stimulate the economy, it's very difficult to do that over the long haul. He will take over the economy. The Italian economy will improve very famously. He's going to get the trains running on schedule. And he starts to divide up the economy, the Italian economy, into these like massive nationalist corporations that are run by the government. And he starts what he calls his war on wheat, which is funny because in America that would mean you're going against wheat. But in Italy, what that means is we got to start growing wheat. And so he essentially takes over, these farms and tells people no more growing what you want. You're going to grow wheat because that's what we need to stay alive. And it's really successful, and at least in the short term. And he does that for all different parts of the economy, and then immediately starts to remilitarize Italy. He knows that he needs to, as a dictator, make sure that he is constantly keeping the people happy. And one of the things that Italy was upset about during or shortly after World War One and the Treaty of Versailles was that Italy had lost national prestige. Well, Mussolini has a plan to try and fix that. So Italy had recently tried to invade Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a North African nation, and that nation is, technologically just not very advanced. And so Italy, tried to invade years and years and years back, and they were embarrassed. The Ethiopians were actually able to defeat the Italians. This is like was just devastating for Italian pride. You got to remember, the Romans were Italians, and so they have this sense of national identity and nationalistic pride. And then Ethiopians that have just these like makeshift armies. They're not very militarized. There's just very little technology in Ethiopia, and they defeat the Italians, and so Mussolini wants his revenge that many Italians want. And so he will successfully reinvade Ethiopia in 1935. When he wins there, and he will win big, it sends a signal to the rest of the world that Italy doesn't belong at the kiddie table, that Mussolini has taken over, and Italy is on the up and up. And so what we see here is a map just so you can process exactly where Ethiopia is. Italy is in the top part of your screen there. They will have colonized Libya. They go to war with Ethiopia and retake Ethiopia. They also have colony in Eritrea. And so Italy is expanding its wings. And so, other dictators or wannabe dictators are looking at this and want to follow suit. One of those dictators, or future dictators, I should say, is Adolf Hitler. He's seeing Italy's success and realizes that this is an opportunity here. The West, and by the West, I mean Great Britain and France and America, have been saying no more wars, no more conquering, right? We want smaller militaries. The League of Nations is designed to stop wars and stop countries from going to war. The Kellogg-Briand Pact has outlawed war. And the Washington Naval Conference has meant to limit the size of navies. And so when Italy comes out and says, forget all that, we're going to war, nobody stops him. and see, like, this is huge, right? Nobody stops them, and because in the West, a lot of us think, well, it's because it's Ethiopia, and uh, it's such a small country, and why does it matter, and why is it worth American lives or British lives to stop Mussolini in Ethiopia? That just doesn't make sense. Well, if you're not willing to stop it in Ethiopia, then Mussolini and Adolf Hitler start to think, well, where else are you not willing to stop it? And it just emboldens dictators when you say no more war, and then you don't follow up with your threats. And so all of a sudden now, because of Ethiopia, we see that the dictators believe, all right, it's open season. Great Britain, France, and America aren't going to do anything to stop us. All right. That, my friends, is where we are going to stop for the day. I'm going to try and figure out how to turn this thing off. Um, and in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you are doing your schoolwork, washing your hands, and staying away from Meemaw. Don't get Meemaw sick. Thank you very much. Have a good night.